Shout out to G-Man Boxing.
Alright, Eubank Jr. has recently given an interview here with Talksport. I'm going to quote this now in a sec. He's been giving his 2 cents on Billy Joe versus Canelo. He's been, saying basically that he feels Billy Joe essentially doesn't have a hope against Canelo, and basically kind of saying that Billy Joe and Canelo were different levels, but he's kind of on that level. Well, I'll get into this now in a sec. I'm going to quote what Eubank Jr. said here to Talksport. He says that he's put actually a £10,000 bet on Canelo to KO Billy Joe Saunders, and he says here, it's different levels. I don't feel Billy Joe Saunders has improved since he fought me. I don't think Billy Joe has what it takes. I have what it takes. I know the way to beat Canelo. End of quote. He's also actually stated that Roy Jones Jr. will be in his corner for his upcoming fight against Marcus Morrison. We obviously know that Roy Jones has been training with Eubank for the last year. Eubank went over to him following on from the win over Korobov. He's obviously not fought since then. But his fight coming up against Marcus Morrison on the 1st of May. I mean, that really will put you in good stead for a Canelo fight, Marcus Morrison. In terms of what he's saying there about Billy Joe not improving since they fought 7 years this year. It's been a while. It's been actually a quick 7 years. But Billy Joe has improved since then. It's just, I don't feel Billy Joe was improved to the level of which he should. That's not to say he's not good, he is. I think that the lack of discipline, the inconsistency in Billy Joe's career, the stop-start of Billy Joe's career, has maybe taken the years where we could have seen Billy Joe really at his peak. Maybe we're gone past that. When Billy Joe is on it and he's switched on and he's motivated, he's in shape, he is a joy to watch. The problem is inconsistency. We do see that Billy Joe aesthetically looks very good going into this fight, so I believe we are going to get to see the best Billy Joe. I'm not picking him to win, but I think this has 12-round decision written all over it for Canelo. I think we're going to see a very good fight. In terms of what Eubank is saying there, I mean, Eubank has been... Look, it's obvious Eubank wants the Canelo fight. It's been obvious since the get-go. I think that was one of the reasons why it didn't work with PBC, because when he was signed with Al Heyman, they were really trying to maneuver him into a Charlo fight. He fought on Charlo's undercard, Jamal Charlo, but even throughout that time, he was always mentioning Canelo. He was always saying, Canelo's the fight the fans want. No fan was really calling for it, but it was always what Eubank Jr. seemingly said to want. Now, he's insisting that he's improved to be on Canelo's. He hasn't. All right, Eubank Jr. has improved since the Billy Joe Saunders fight. There's no doubt about that. But has he improved sufficiently? No. Under Roy Jones, we'll need to see how he looks. When he first announced that he was moving to Roy Jones, I made videos about it, and people kept telling me, this is the great move. Look at Roy Jones in his prime. Look how good Roy Jones was. Eubank's going to learn so much from him. And I said, well, no. Well, 2 things. One, being a great fighter doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a good trainer, right? It's not always the way. But second of all, Roy Jones, from a technical point of view in his prime, he made a lot of mistakes. He was athletic, very athletic. But in terms of technique, Roy Jones was never the most technically sound. So what Eubank Jr., his issue has never been athleticism. It's always been fundamental technique. So therefore, when I look at Roy Jones, I think this is a fighter who in his prime was not the most fundamentally gifted fighter. He was athletically gifted as hell, but his basic fundamentals, he would do things that's a no-no in boxing. So when I looked at that combination, I just kind of scratched my head and thought, maybe that's not a good combo. Well, again, we need to see how Eubank Jr. looks. Again, Marcus Morrison, it's a horrible mismatch. It's not going to tell us much realistically. It's just not going to tell us much. So we'll need to see how that goes. But in terms of him saying he's on levels with Canelo, I mean, Eubank Jr. is someone who talks a lot. He tries to big himself up in the lead up to fights, right? He's done that throughout his career. For me, I think Eubank Jr. shouldn't do that. I mean, some people would say like, he needs to do it, but what kind of fighter is going to turn around and say like he's better than me? I don't mean it like that. What I mean is, there have been fighters throughout history of boxing who have bigged themselves up and said, I'm on the same level as this guy, I'm better than this guy, I'm this, I'm that. They put pressure on themselves before they've gotten the ring. Now, for some fighters, like Tyson Fury and like Chris Eubank Sr., it worked to their advantage because it lit that extra bit of fire in them. But to other fighters, it's been a hindrance, like Audley Harrison. I'm not saying if Audley Harrison had taken a humble approach in his career, he would have done any better than he did. I don't know. I suspect he might have. I'm not saying he would have won world titles or anything like that, but I definitely think that him putting all that pressure on himself caused him to underperform. And I think the same with Chris Eubank Jr. I think that if he would come at it from a more humble point of view, he might not have froze early on against Billy Joe. He might not have froze against George Groves, because he is putting a lot of pressure on himself by saying, I'm better than this guy, I'm this, I'm all these things and more, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But when it gets time to it, it's like, right now you got to show up. We've seen it with Eubank. He's capitulated. He's not been able to handle the pressure. I think for him, maybe taking a more humble approach and just not saying anything would be more beneficial to Eubank. As I've said, you look at Audley Harrison, he very similar, would big himself up, would say this, that, the other, would say all these things, and then he would just, it never happened in the ring. Like, I think he said he knocked David Hay out and all that. Do you remember that? And he didn't land a punch in that fight. Whereas you look at the opposite end of the spectrum, Tyson Fury says all these things, goes out and does them for the most part. So that's what I got to say about Eubank Jr. Look, I'm happy to see Eubank Jr. back in the ring. I do like Eubank Jr. Could you imagine he got the Canelo fight? You just imagine it. He actually got the Canelo fight next and he won. Canelo-Saunders, how he would be. He would sniff Bolivia dry. Literally, Canelo-Saunders would be on cloud 9. But we need to just see how Eubank Jr. goes. Like, he's staying at 160 for the foreseeable future. Marcus Morrison, look, I just want to see Eubank Jr. back in the ring. He'll get a run out. We'll see how he looks. He's been out of the ring for a while, and even then, when he was in the ring, he was only in the ring for 2 rounds. So I like watching Eubank Jr. He's one of my favourite fighters to watch. But there's a few questions, because how old is Eubank Jr. now? He's got to be in his 30s, early 30s. This may be the time where we see some of that athleticism diminish. Eubank Jr., he's got to be about 31, easily. In fact, no, because sometimes that can take too long, but he's got to be about 30, 31. So around about this time, we may start to see him slow down a bit. Not, badly, but that athleticism may start to kind of dwindle a little bit. So we need to see how he looks. But I just found that interesting, that he was saying all that. In terms of the bet he's putting on Billy Joe, them two don't like one another. And that's actually quite, to be fair, that rematch is a big money fight in the UK. If we had fans in attendance, it definitely is. But Eubank Jr., I think that 10k might be lost. I can't see Canelo stopping Billy Joe, personally. Unless maybe to the body, but I can't see that. Those are my thoughts on this. Let me know yours in the comment section. He said that he knows how to beat Canelo. I mean, realistically, like Beterbiev, Bivol, 2 light heavyweights, are people you'd give a shot to beat Canelo. Anyone else, it's a hard ask. It's a very hard ask. Maybe Triple G, but at this stage, probably not. But it's a hard ask. Do you believe Chris Eubank Jr.? And what do you think of his comments? Let me know in the comment section below. I hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, smash the like button. Subscribe, of course, if you haven't already. I will talk to you lads and lassies. Peace.